There is a quiet storm building in the heart of Europe, not a market tantrum, not a passing recession, something deeper, something systemic. Beneath the layers of technical jargon and cautious bureaucratic language lies a simple, cold truth. The arithmetic no longer works. And arithmetic doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait for reforms or respond to political optimism. It just adds, subtracts, and exposes cracks until structures give way. That moment is no longer on the horizon. It's approaching with accelerating speed, and Europe is woefully unprepared. In March 2025, an internal document started circulating within the finance ministries of key EU member states. Not classified, but certainly not released to the public. By page 47, a single statement cuts through the clutter like a blade. By the end of 2027, maintaining the Eurozone becomes a net negative proposition for most of its members. This is not a forecast. It's not even a warning. It's a death sentence written in equations. Let's be blunt. Europe is not grappling with cyclical downturns or external shocks. The issue is structural, terminal, and inscribed in the DNA of the monetary union itself, and the clock is ticking. What happens when the very architecture of the euro begins to extract more pain than prosperity? We're about to find out. The timeline is no longer abstract. It's down to quarters, and behind closed doors, policymakers know it. Already, the strongest economies are taking defensive positions. In Q1 of 2025, Dutch investment funds shifted 87 billion euros away from Eurozone assets into dollar, Swiss franc, and pound-denominated instruments. That's not diversification. That's evacuation. And it's spreading. German insurers have trimmed Eurozone bond exposure by 12% in just half a year. French pension managers are redirecting capital toward American and Asian markets. Italy's elite are quietly funneling wealth to London, Dubai, Singapore, locations historically associated with shelter from storm. This is not a moment of crisis. It is something more dangerous, a calculated retreat. Institutional capital, the kind that thinks in decades rather than quarters, is repositioning. Not in panic, but with certainty. The numbers no longer justify staying. And the people pulling the levers have come to a conclusion. The system they once backed is now irreparably broken. Why is this happening? Not because of incompetence, not because of malevolence, but because of a contradiction built into the Eurozone. From its inception, a currency union was forged without the machinery of fiscal union. That's a construction built to last only in ideal conditions, and Europe is nowhere near ideal. Productivity gaps remain chasms. Economic cycles diverge. Labor mobility is crippled by linguistic and regulatory hurdles. The political will to transfer wealth between nations has collapsed. This is the setup. One central bank trying to navigate wildly divergent economies with a single interest rate. In Q1 of 2025, Germany was running hot, inflation at 4.2%, wage growth soaring, property prices overheating. Greece, at the same moment, was descending into contraction, GDP down, unemployment above 14%, deflation taking hold. A single rate can't serve both. The ECB split the difference, and everyone lost. Germany got asset bubbles. Greece got austerity without relief. This is not policy failure, it's structural design failure, and it's accelerating. Bond spreads tell the story. Germany's 10-year yield at 2.4%, Italy's at 4.1%. The same currency, radically different borrowing conditions. And that gap is not a temporary mispricing. It's a reflection of systemic misfit. Italy, saddled with debt at 152% of GDP, bleeds under ECB-imposed constraints. Stimulus is blocked. Currency devaluation is impossible. Independent rate cuts are off the table. Every tool a sovereign state might use in crisis has been surrendered. The debt mounts, the costs grow, and every step forward is dragged backward by rules built for another economy. Across southern Europe, the pattern repeats. Debt traps, fiscal straitjackets, youth unemployment, investment stagnation. Meanwhile, in the north, an asset bubble metastasizes. Dutch home prices are up 147% since 2015. An 18-year savings timeline is now required for a down payment. Monetary policy built to stabilize the South is pricing out the next generation in the North. This is not integration. It's fragmentation. Not solidarity, but resentment. And resentment is combustible. The question is not whether this system breaks. It is when and what follows. Because this is no longer a debate about policy. It's a countdown driven by arithmetic. The illusion that Europe can hold together through shared currency alone is beginning to fracture under the weight of cold, quantifiable retreat. The numbers are no longer hinting, they're screaming. And the flows of capital tell the story more plainly than any commission report or summit speech ever could. 400 billion tausers. That's the net capital outflow from the Eurozone in 2024. Not churn, not cyclical movement. That's excess leaving, not being replaced, and it's the biggest since the Euro's inception. Break that figure down, and it becomes even more damning. Nearly 1/3 has been redirected to the United States, another quarter to Switzerland. The rest is dispersing across Britain, Asia, and into the relative anonymity of gold and cryptocurrencies. This isn't speculative money jumping ship. It's pensions, insurance reserves, family offices, sovereign wealth. This is long horizon, stability first capital saying the quiet part loud. The Eurozone is no longer seen as structurally safe. And the real danger isn't the total, it's the slope. In Q3 2024, the average monthly net outflow was $16 billion Q4, $23 billion. By Q1 2025, $42 billion. That's not a trend. It's a signal flare. The trajectory is exponential. We've seen this pattern before, just before 2012, when Europe's last debt shock threatened to unravel the project. Back then, it was caught in time by ECB promises. This time, the same tools are less effective, and the institutional investors know it. They move first, always. They see the internal contradictions and act before politicians even acknowledge the smoke. The quiet phase of retreat is ending. The institutional phase is underway. Next comes the panic phase, the retail phase, when smaller investors, households, and businesses follow en masse. At that point, the damage becomes self-perpetuating, and that's where the real collapse begins. So why doesn't the European Central Bank step in, pull the levers, and reverse the course? Because it can't. The ECB is stuck in a trap of its own making. It has one mandate: price stability near 2% inflation. But in early 2025, Germany was pushing 4.2% inflation, while Greece hovered at 0.7%. The Eurozone average, 2.4%, looked acceptable. But averages lie. A policy that suits the average suits no one. Raise rates to contain German inflation? Greece slides deeper into depression. Hold rates steady to protect the periphery? German bubbles swell. The ECB isn't making bad choices. It's making impossible ones. Because no single rate is right for a continent with irreconcilable economic realities. Inside the ECB, they know this. Their own internal papers acknowledge that one-size-fits-all monetary policy is widening divergence, not closing it. Yet politically, they are bound. Admitting failure would mean questioning the euro itself, and that remains a taboo few dare to break. So they resort to the usual central banker's playbook: buy time, quantitative easing, bond purchases, liquidity facilities, unconventional policies meant to delay the inevitable, and as they delay, their balance sheet balloons. By early 2025, ECB assets reached $8.9 trillion, over 76% of Eurozone GDP. For comparison, the Fed's balance sheet was at 37% of U.S. GDP. The Bank of England? 42%. Europe's central bank is now the most overextended in the developed world. What's on that balance sheet? Mostly government bonds, debt of member states whose deficits are far beyond the treaty limits. In truth, the ECB is no longer a central bank in the traditional sense. It has become the buyer of last resort for sovereign debt that no one else wants. That keeps governments solvent, but at a cost. The more debt the ECB absorbs, the more member states depend on it. And the deeper the ECB sinks into political entanglements it was never designed to handle. If it stops buying, yields spike. Governments face funding crises overnight. But if it keeps buying, it becomes the biggest bag holder in an unsustainable system. This is not just a balance sheet issue. It's a political crisis disguised as monetary policy. The ECB can't save the Eurozone from what's coming because the Eurozone's design created the problem. The trap is set. And with every passing quarter, the spring tightens. At this stage, the question isn't whether the system continues to deteriorate. It's whether the unraveling will be managed or explode. At some point, all denial gives way to hard decisions. That point is now within sight for Europe. The scaffolding holding the euro together is splintering, not from external assault, but from internal contradictions reaching their terminal phase. And every possible path forward is defined not by opportunity, but by damage control. 3 futures lie ahead. All grim, one barely manageable, the others catastrophic. First, a coordinated dismantling of the monetary union. A scenario where nations negotiate exits, reintroduce national currencies, restructure debt, and reclaim policy autonomy. Painful? Certainly, but orderly. With planning, capital controls, legal frameworks, and international support, it could be done. A trauma, yes, but one Europe could recover from within a decade. Yet this path demands something scarce in European politics: courage. No major government wants the stain of breaking up the euro. The myth of monetary union as the core of European identity is deeply embedded. Any discussion of exit is cast as betrayal, not reform. The treaties are rigid, the political appetite absent, which is why this outcome, though economically rational, remains politically remote. The second path is far more likely and far more dangerous: a chaotic disintegration, triggered not by design, but by accident. A sovereign default, a failed bond auction, a political crisis in a fragile state. Something snaps, and the currency union begins to break in real time. Panic spreads, bank runs erupt, payment systems buckle. Emergency capital controls go up overnight. Assets are frozen. The global financial system reels. This is the Europe of Argentina in 2001, of the Soviet Union in 1991, where economic collapse outruns political capacity to contain it, where millions are left with worthless accounts, governments fall, and order becomes aspirational rather than guaranteed. It's a future no one wants, but one that becomes more likely the longer leaders pretend the status quo can hold. Then comes the third scenario. Not collapse, but centralization. Not breakup, but command. The EU's elite, faced with crisis, push for deeper integration under duress. Fiscal union not through consensus, but decree. Brussels gains taxation power. It controls national budgets. Democratic processes in member states are overridden in the name of stability. Economic governance becomes centralized, top-down, unaccountable. This is the route many within EU institutions quietly prefer. They see the crisis as validation. More integration is the answer. But this isn't federalism built on trust. It's technocratic authoritarianism born of desperation. Rich countries would need to permanently subsidize poorer ones. Poor countries would surrender the last levers of sovereignty. National parliaments become irrelevant. Democratic legitimacy erodes. And here lies the tragedy. Each of these futures emerges not from abstract ideology, but from choices made decades ago. When the euro was launched without a fiscal union, economists warned of exactly this convergence toward dysfunction. They were ignored. Political dreams overrode technical caution. Now the reckoning arrives. What's likely? A mix of all three. Some states may negotiate exit. Others will be forced out by market shock. A remaining core might unify more tightly. But make no mistake, the Eurozone of 2030 will not resemble the Eurozone of 2025. The reshaping is coming. The only question is how much wreckage it leaves behind. And this isn't just a currency issue. It's about the entire economic future of the continent. The price for delay is being paid in human capital, productivity, and trust. Youth unemployment above 30% in parts of southern Europe. Decades of growth lost to bad policy imposed by one-size-fits-all mandates. The most dynamic, educated citizens leaving their countries for good. People are no longer waiting for reform. They are opting out, quietly, permanently. That is the real verdict on the euro, not in parliamentary debates or treaty negotiations, but in the choices made by families, businesses, and institutions. Capital is fleeing, talent is leaving, trust is evaporating. And none of it is reversible without acknowledging the core truth. The euro, as it stands, is no longer sustainable. Whether Europe chooses to deconstruct it with precision or lets it implode under pressure will define the next generation. You can't fix what you refuse to name. And across Europe's capitals, that refusal has become the default setting. Officials still speak of reforms, stability pacts, and fiscal responsibility as if any of it can reverse the arithmetic. But numbers don't bend to narrative, and the numbers are merciless. Italy is the clearest proof. Debt now stands at 152% of GDP, up from 135% just 5 years ago. Annual deficits have exploded to 5.8%, well above the EU's formal limit of 3%. And those rules? Still technically in force, still largely ignored. Interest payments alone eat up 11% of government revenues. That's not fiscal policy. That's fiscal captivity. Every lever that could offer relief, currency devaluation, rate cuts, targeted stimulus, is beyond Italy's reach, because none of them reside in Rome anymore. They're locked in Brussels and Frankfurt, governed by consensus among economies that share neither conditions nor priorities. And for Italy, that means paralysis. The result? A slow-motion suffocation. Investment collapses. Growth flatlines. Young workers flee. The country remains nominally solvent only because the ECB continues to buy its debt. But even that lifeline is fraying. Every new bond added to the ECB's portfolio increases the risk of systemic exposure. The central bank is not acting as a lender of last resort. It's functioning as a buyer of political time. And time is nearly up. Spain, Portugal, Greece, variations on the same theme. All tethered to a monetary regime that demands discipline while denying tools. Debt grows. Private investment shrinks. Structural unemployment persists. The result is stagnation, decade after decade. Southern Europe has effectively become a zone of constrained recovery, forced to absorb the economic slack of the Eurozone without compensation. Meanwhile, the North is boiling over, particularly the Netherlands. Since 2015, Dutch housing prices have soared by 147%, and that's adjusted for inflation. Not because the economy is roaring, but because interest rates held low to accommodate southern weakness have ignited a credit inferno in the north. This is the cruel irony. Monetary policy designed to support struggling economies is pricing an entire generation out of homeownership in others. Young Dutch families now face an 18-year saving period for a median home down payment. In 2010, it was 7. The reward for following rules, maintaining fiscal discipline, and playing by the book is asset bubbles that rob the next generation. The political fallout is no longer theoretical. Northern voters don't see solidarity. They see sacrifice. Southern voters don't hear support. They hear scolding. Resentment is no longer brewing. It's spilling into the streets and into the ballot boxes. And the logic of the euro only deepens the divide. When economies need different policies but receive the same one, each blames the other. Northern Europe sees itself as underwriting Southern failure. Southern Europe sees itself as strangled by Northern arrogance. Both narratives are partially true. That's what makes them impossible to reconcile. This isn't mismanagement. It's baked-in dysfunction. A single monetary policy will always create friction in a region with radically divergent economies unless there is a mechanism for ongoing redistribution. And that mechanism has been politically rejected time and again. What remains is a shell of cooperation sustained by fear of collapse, not mutual benefit. And that's not sustainable, not economically, not politically, not socially. Every passing month under this model adds another layer of pressure on governments, on institutions, on citizens. The system is demanding sacrifices it can no longer justify, and those being asked to bear the cost are losing patience. That's not just instability, that's pre-collapse dynamics. The capital flight we're seeing isn't about today's risks, it's about tomorrow's certainty. Investors, institutions, and citizens are not waiting for the final blow. They're acting on patterns that repeat with grim predictability. And the signal is clear. The architecture is failing. The exits are being marked. The countdown is active. The deeper this goes, the less it looks like a financial imbalance, and the more it reveals itself as a legitimacy crisis. The monetary union is no longer merely failing to deliver prosperity. It is actively producing dysfunction, and in the process, it's eroding the very political foundations that once held it together. Look at the youth of Europe. For 15 years now, a generation has come of age knowing only stagnation. In 2024, youth unemployment across the Eurozone averaged 17.3%. In Spain, it was 28%. In Greece, 32%. These aren't short-term anomalies. They are structural scars. Permanent damage inflicted by a system that has made policy flexibility a historical relic. This isn't just about statistics. It's about time, years lost, futures deferred, ambitions abandoned. Tens of millions of young Europeans have spent their most productive years waiting for reforms that never came, for growth that never arrived, for promises that never materialized. And they're done waiting. The most skilled, mobile, and ambitious have already left. Since 2010, Greece has lost nearly 500,000 working-age citizens to emigration. Portugal, 300,000. Ireland, 200,000. These aren't retirees. These are engineers, doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, the very people economies need to renew themselves. And they are voting with their feet, quietly, permanently, and with devastating consequence. What's left behind is a demographic time bomb. Aging populations, shrinking tax bases, sclerotic labor markets. Southern Europe isn't just falling behind economically, it's entering a cycle of irreversible decline. And every year that the euro persists in its current form locks in more of that trajectory. Meanwhile, The political center is cracking. The parties that once championed European integration have no credible answers. Their tools are gone. Their narratives have collapsed. Their voters are turning elsewhere. In Italy, the far right holds power. In the Netherlands, they've surged. In Austria, Finland, France, the same pattern. Even the far left is gaining ground in Spain and Greece. These movements don't agree on policy, but they agree on one thing. The current system is broken, and those defending it are out of touch. Mainstream leaders blame populism, disinformation, Russian interference, social media echo chambers, anything except the obvious. When people suffer economic pain with no relief, no voice, and no future, they look for anyone who promises to burn down the house. And the euro has become the house, the symbol of a model that extracts more than it delivers. That demands loyalty while offering decay. That enforces rules designed for stability on economies sinking under those very rules. This dynamic cannot be reversed with messaging, or slight tweaks to deficit ceilings, or another round of technocratic fixes. The problem isn't optics, it's structure, and the structure is now visibly producing social fragmentation. We are watching a feedback loop in action. Economic dysfunction drives political radicalization. Political radicalization makes reform harder. The absence of reform deepens economic pain, and the cycle accelerates. What's collapsing isn't just trust in Brussels or Frankfurt. It's trust in the very idea that a common currency can unify a continent of economic strangers. And that collapse doesn't play out in headlines. It plays out in declining birth rates, in property sold at a loss, in young people abandoning languages and passports, in protests that no longer ask for better governance but demand rupture. The question isn't whether the euro is failing. That's answered. The question now is whether the democratic frameworks of Europe can survive the failure of the euro. Every sign suggests they're being tested beyond their limits. And unless something fundamental changes, the system won't bend. It will break. And when it does, it won't be subtle. It will be generational. There comes a moment in every failing system when symptoms can no longer be dismissed as anomalies. When fragmentation isn't a trend, it's a destination. Europe has crossed that line. And the cracks are no longer just economic or political. They're institutional. The machinery itself is beginning to seize. Start with the ECB, the institution at the heart of the euro. Its balance sheet now equals 76% of Eurozone GDP. That's not policy experimentation. That's systemic overreach. For comparison, the Fed hovers around 37%, the Bank of England 42%. Europe is in a different league, not of power but of exposure. What's it holding? Mostly government debt, junk-rated in some cases, issued by countries whose deficits long ago breached treaty boundaries. The ECB is not stimulating economies. It's keeping them from collapsing. It has become the only willing buyer for debts that the private sector increasingly shuns. This is not monetary policy. This is political triage, dressed up in banker speak. The ECB was never meant to carry this load. It has no fiscal authority, no democratic mandate. And yet, without it, half the continent would face sovereign funding crises overnight. That's not stability. That's dependency. And the more the ECB intervenes, the deeper the trap becomes. Member states stop fearing market consequences and start assuming central bank backstops. Fiscal discipline erodes. Structural reforms are delayed. Why make tough decisions if the bond market is rigged? But the ECB can't unwind its position without detonating the very economies it props up. Nor can it expand indefinitely without risking its own credibility. The paradox is lethal. Action invites future collapse. Inaction guarantees it. and everyone knows it. Behind closed doors, finance ministries are no longer debating if contingency plans are needed. They're drafting them. Internal documents now explore coordinated exits, debt redenomination mechanisms, and legal firewalls, quietly, reluctantly, but consistently. The system's custodians are no longer pretending this can go on forever, and that's because they're watching the same data the markets see. Capital flight isn't slowing, it's accelerating. In Q1 2025, $42 billion per month on average fled the Eurozone. Not because of panic, but because of logic. When even conservative institutions begin reallocating long-term portfolios away from Europe, the message is clear. They don't see a future here. That kind of judgment doesn't reverse easily. It's not driven by headlines. It's driven by models, scenarios, and actuarial projections. And once those assumptions shift, it takes years, if ever, to bring capital back. The knock-on effects are brutal. Less investment means less growth. Less growth means rising debt to GDP ratios. Rising ratios mean higher borrowing costs. And around it goes. The doom loop of modern sovereign finance, accelerated by the rigidity of a currency union. In this environment, even minor shocks become systemic threats. A failed budget vote, a bank downgrade, a government collapse in a mid-sized member state. Under normal conditions, these are headlines. In the Eurozone, they are potential catalysts for cascade failure. And the global context isn't helping. The U.S. is reindustrializing. Asia is expanding. Capital has options. Europe no longer commands default trust. Its advantages, human capital, infrastructure, innovation, are still there. But the policy framework neutralizes them. Like an athlete forced to run in shackles, it cannot compete, no matter how capable. What remains is inertia. A continent rich in resources, trapped by its own design, drifting toward breakdown. And at the helm, leaders constrained by treaties they can't amend, and electorates they no longer understand. The line between crisis prevention and crisis management is thin. Europe has crossed it, and now it must choose. Radical adaptation or uncontrollable fracture. Delay at this stage is a decision, and it's the most dangerous one available. The longer this system is allowed to drift, the more dangerous the eventual reckoning becomes. The fuse has been lit, not by ideology or panic, but by arithmetic. And what's approaching is not a slow unraveling. It's an acceleration towards systemic failure. Every pillar holding the Eurozone upright is now double functioning as a pressure point. Take government debt. The theoretical ceiling of 60% of GDP enshrined in EU law is long irrelevant. Italy is at 152%. France is pushing 120%. Spain is climbing rapidly. These are not wartime surges. They are persistent, structural, and unaffordable without external intervention. What used to be a warning level has now become baseline reality. The rules remain, but only on paper. And every time they are ignored without consequence, the signal to markets is clear. The foundation is political fiction. Stability is now a managed illusion, contingent on coordination that is fraying. Add to this the persistent imbalance in competitiveness. Germany continues to benefit from a currency that is undervalued for its economy. Southern Europe suffers from an overvalued euro that prices out its exports and chokes growth. There is no convergence, only divergence masked by accounting. Internal trade imbalances that should have self-corrected via currency adjustments are now frozen. Germany runs massive surpluses. The South bleeds deficits. In a floating system, exchange rates would realign. In the euro, nothing realigns. The imbalances deepen, and resentment calcifies. Then there's the social fabric. Not abstract cohesion, but literal functionality. In nations like Greece, Portugal, and even parts of France and Italy, state capacity is eroding. Services are deteriorating. Infrastructure is crumbling. Public trust is collapsing. Why? Because the fiscal handcuffs prevent investment. Austerity isn't a past mistake. It's an ongoing mandate. And while some argue these constraints enforce discipline, the result has been the opposite. Starved governments don't reform. They disintegrate. Ministries can't attract talent. Agencies can't modernize. Courts can't process cases. Schools lose teachers. Hospitals lose staff. The architecture of the state bends toward failure. This is the silent decay of sovereignty. A nation that cannot decide its own budget, set its own interest rate, or defend its labor market is no longer functionally sovereign. It exists, but it cannot act. And that paralysis feeds the sense of humiliation that populists weaponize. The North is not immune either. Their problem is different, but no less acute. Negative interest rates and capital inflows have created massive asset bubbles. Real estate, equities, even farmland are priced beyond rationality. And when these bubbles burst, as they inevitably do, it won't be a contained event. It will be a continental correction. In the Netherlands, housing is no longer shelter, it's speculation. In Germany, the rental crisis is turning middle-class families into political radicals. In Finland and Austria, public anger simmers beneath the surface of orderly politics, all because monetary policy that fits the South distorts the North. This is what makes the crisis so unmanageable. The same policy creates opposite problems across different regions. Fixing it in one place breaks it in another. There's no neutral gear, no consensus path. Every solution creates a new fracture, and yet Brussels clings to the illusion of manageability. More fiscal rules, more oversight, more conditionality. But the underlying contradiction remains untouched. A single currency for many economies, no common treasury, no shared political will to transfer resources. Without that missing piece, permanent, democratically legitimized redistribution, the euro will always be a machine running against its own logic. And eventually, machines that fight themselves break. We are not decades away from that break. We are quarters away, perhaps a few years at most. The signals are no longer subtle. The trend lines are converging. And when they meet, the shock will not be contained within currency markets. It will hit banks, businesses, households. It will rewrite politics in every capital. Europe still has a choice, but it must act like a union with a future or face the consequences of pretending one existed without building it. The alarm bells are no longer theoretical. They are deafening, and they are everywhere. From pension funds to property markets, from Brussels to Athens, from silent withdrawals of capital to street-level unrest, Europe is no longer showing early warning signs. It is exhibiting symptoms of advanced systemic failure. And still, the pretense of stability continues. Mainstream institutions keep issuing forecasts that assume equilibrium will return. Political leaders recite language of reform and resilience. But beneath the surface, every credible economic signal is screaming in the opposite direction. And perhaps the most important and irreversible signal is trust, not in politicians, not in markets, but in the very framework that underpins European economic coordination. Trust isn't lost in one moment. It erodes, quietly, then all at once. And capital is always the first to move. What we are witnessing now is a transfer of wealth, not between countries, but between eras, from a belief in European permanence to a cold calculation of national survival. That calculation is already shaping behavior across the continent. Sovereign wealth funds are shifting allocations. Multinationals are rethinking footprint strategies. Private banks are advising high net worth clients to reduce euro exposure. This isn't panic, it's preparation. And when capital prepares, politics follows. Already we're seeing national leaders publicly flirt with previously unthinkable positions. Calls for referendum, demands for treaty opt-outs, even discussion of parallel currencies. Ideas once considered radical are now surfacing in the political mainstream, not because of ideology, but because of necessity. This is the prelude to fragmentation. Before a system collapses externally, it fractures internally. Common rules are selectively enforced, mutual commitments become hollow, coordinated policy becomes symbolic, and as coherence fades, self-interest takes over. That is where Europe is now. The euro, designed to bind member states together, is now accelerating their divergence. What began as a political project to anchor unity, morphing into an economic fault line that splits the continent into incompatible zones. And this fault line is not just geographic. It is generational, cultural, institutional, northern states with surpluses, aging populations, and asset inflation. Southern states with deficits, youth unemployment, and capital flight. One side sees the euro as a stabilizer. The other sees it as a cage. The ECB, the Commission, the European Council, they all continue to insist that deeper integration is the only path forward. More power to Brussels, more harmonization, more centralized enforcement. But this vision now collides with democratic fatigue and economic exhaustion. What's being proposed is not federalism by consensus, it's federalism by crisis. And the price of that is legitimacy. Because when decisions are centralized without accountability, the public pushes back. We've seen it in every recent election. The message is consistent. Whatever this project was supposed to be, it's no longer working. And yet, no reset is on the table. No serious plans for monetary redesign. No admission that the original architecture is flawed beyond repair. Just more extensions. More stopgaps. More moral hazard concealed as stability. This is the phase where systems become fragile in ways that can no longer be measured by GDP or inflation. Fragility now resides in perception, in the willingness of millions to keep playing by rules that no longer serve them. And once that willingness erodes, rules collapse, regardless of how well they're written. Europe is inching toward that edge. Some countries will try to exit the euro calmly. Others will be forced out violently by market rupture. The remaining core may double down on integration. But the current structure, one currency, many economies, no shared fiscal base, is mathematically unsustainable. The question is not whether this breaks. The question is which form the break takes. And whether Europe is prepared for any of them. Right now, it isn't. And every quarter of delay brings that unpreparedness closer to disaster. We are past the stage of hypothetical stress tests. What's unfolding in Europe is a real-world failure of a monetary regime under maximum strain, and the speed is picking up. The divergence isn't just widening, it's compounding. And in systems like these, compounding doesn't end in stalemate. It ends in fracture. Every attempt to hold things together through temporary fixes has only deepened the structural imbalance. The ECB's quantitative easing programs, meant to stabilize, have morphed into permanent crutches. Fiscal rules are either suspended or ignored. Emergency measures have become permanent features. This isn't adaptation. It's institutional decay disguised as pragmatism. And now, the illusion of convergence is finally shattering. The promise that joining the euro would lift poorer economies into alignment with richer ones has not materialized. On the contrary, the longer countries remain locked into this structure, the more their productive capacity erodes. Greece, for example, is producing less real output today than it did before joining the euro over 2 decades ago. Portugal has lost an entire generation of skilled labor to migration. Italy's productivity has been flatlined for years, while its debt soars. These are not anomalies. These are systemic outcomes. At the same time, Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria have benefited from undervalued exchange rates and captive export markets within the Eurozone. But even they are now hitting the wall. Asset inflation is pricing out their middle classes. Demographic decline is accelerating, and the cost of propping up the South through backdoor mechanisms like ECB bond buying is growing intolerable. This leads to a volatile psychological shift, one that markets and policymakers often underestimate. When both sides of a union start feeling like they're losing, the center cannot hold. The North feels exploited. The South feels strangled. And no one sees a future in the middle. From this psychological fracture comes political fragmentation. Coalition governments are breaking apart under the strain. Anti-EU rhetoric is no longer fringe. It's featured in national debates. Policymakers are paralyzed between two equally unacceptable choices: acknowledge failure and risk collapse, or deny reality and feed the eventual explosion. The European elite continue to float visions of a fiscal union as if integrating deeper will fix a problem caused by premature integration. But this path requires political capital that no one possesses. It would mean surrendering national control over budgets, taxes, and social policy to supranational entities. Voters are not buying it. Referendums would fail, and leaders know it. So the push for integration is no longer democratic. It's administrative. Brussels imposes. National governments comply or face penalties. But this is governance without consent. And governance without consent is not governance, it's erosion. As that erosion deepens, capital continues to leave. Long-term investors aren't waiting for policy pivots. They're acting on actuarial certainty. They see the balance sheets, they read the fine print, and they're moving to jurisdictions where policy is aligned with economic fundamentals. The Eurozone, by contrast, is a monument to policy misalignment. One currency, 19 economic cycles, 19 fiscal conditions, 19 electorates, zero structural flexibility, no lever that fits all, and no willingness to admit that no such lever exists. This is where systems enter terminal phases. Not with a bang, but with a long erosion of cohesion, capacity, and confidence. Until one small shock, an election, a bond auction, a bank failure, triggers the cascade. That moment is no longer unthinkable. It is approaching. And unless Europe prepares, it will arrive in chaos rather than design. The time for design is almost gone. What remains is crisis management. And the tools for that are weaker than they appear, because they depend on trust. And trust, once lost, does not return on demand. This is the final stage, where hope is no longer a policy and delay becomes an accelerant. Europe is not drifting into instability. It is accelerating toward rupture, with every institution caught between fear of action and terror of consequence. And the numbers have stopped blinking. They're flashing red. The document circulating quietly through Europe's finance ministries since early 2025 didn't mince words. Its final recommendation? Prepare technical frameworks for multiple contingencies, including coordinated exits from the monetary union. That alone is seismic, not because it's radical, but because it's official recognition that the system may not hold. For years, the Euro's defenders claimed that no serious economist proposed exit scenarios. Now, technocrats are quietly sketching blueprints for them because they understand the logic of arithmetic. And arithmetic says this can't continue. 3 trillion euros. That's the estimated GDP gap, the amount of economic output lost over the past decade because member states were bound by one-size-fits-all monetary constraints. This isn't abstract. That's 3 trillion in businesses not started, wages not earned, infrastructure not built. It's lives redirected by artificial economic limits. Youth unemployment has averaged over 20% in several member states for more than a decade. This isn't cyclical, it's structural. It's what happens when policy is locked into misalignment year after year. The result isn't just underperformance. It's detonation of the social contract. And what fills the vacuum? extremism, political violence, institutional decay. Already the center is collapsing. Fringe parties dominate parliaments. Nationalist rhetoric is normal. Democratic legitimacy is fraying. And the European ideal is dissolving into recrimination and distrust. But none of this is a surprise. Economists warned before the euro's creation that monetary union without fiscal union would eventually fail. They were ignored. Political ambition overrode economic logic. The price of that hubris is now due, with interest. What's worse, the delay has raised the stakes. Had countries exited 10 years ago, the cost would have been high, but manageable. Now, with sovereign debt ratios ballooned, capital mobility reduced, and social cohesion eroded, the risks of disorder are vastly higher. And yet the trajectory is locked in. Retail investors may still be unaware, but institutional capital has moved, and bureaucrats are no longer hiding from the math. They see what's coming. The only ones still pretending are the politicians, because they fear the consequences of being the first to speak plainly. But silence no longer buys time. It buys vulnerability. Every month of inaction makes the system more fragile, the break more inevitable. And when it comes, the options will no longer include control. It will be chaos or coercion. Europe stands at the final fork in the road. One path leads to negotiated dissolution, a painful but structured exit process governed by law, supported by contingency planning, and aimed at restoring sovereign flexibility. The other leads to collapse, disorder, contagion, emergency capital controls, and institutional breakdown. There is a third path. Technocratic authoritarianism, power centralized in Brussels, national sovereignty subordinated to unelected administrators, permanent fiscal transfers, direct taxation powers. That's not integration, that's imposition. Some in the elite believe this is the solution, but the public will not follow. The backlash would be existential. And even if imposed, it would not address the original flaw: one currency, many economies, no political union. That contradiction would remain and continue to metastasize. The choice is brutal, but it is no longer optional. Europe can either act while there is still some margin for design, or it can wait until the collapse designs itself. The clock is no longer ticking, it is striking. The endgame is in motion, and the only unknown is how much damage will be allowed before someone dares to stop it. Because now, it's no longer about saving the euro, it's about saving Europe from what the euro has become.